this is Dave Thomas, and this time I'm building the Skybird payloader model rocket kit from Custom Rockets. And so we'll go ahead and open this up and check for all the parts. Okay, some decals there that are stuck in the instructions. Watch for those. Okay, so first let's look at the small parts package here. We've got two centering rings, engine mount tube, clip, and then the base to the nose cone and the thrust ring. Okay, decals there, parachute, payload bay, upper part of the nose cone, fin material. We have a balsa block here. You don't see these too much anymore in most kits. Alright, main body tube and shock cord. Okay, so coming back to our instructions, we're missing a launch lug. Oh, there it is. Okay, launch lug may be inside your engine mount tube. Alright, and it looks like we have everything else. One thing I would suggest adding to this kit is a snap swivel like this one here. You can get these in the fishing section of most department stores, sporting goods stores, etc. But I like to use this to attach my parachutes, giving me more options with them. Okay, so since we have everything here, I'm going to go ahead and clear this up and we will get started. Our first job is to assemble the engine mount. And to do this, we're going to need everything out of the small parts bag here. And then we can set aside the launch lug and the nose cone base. We'll do those later. Okay, so we should have a slot pre-made here. But if yours does not, and check both ends, then you need to make that slot a 1/4 inch down from the forward end. And just to prevent future confusion, I'm going to write aft on this end so that we know where it's supposed to be oriented. Okay, so first of all, we can simply take this, make sure it fits into that slot. Okay, no problem there. And now we need to make a couple of markings here. So from each end, we want to mark 1/2 inch. And this is where the centering rings will go. So we've got 1/2 inch there. And then down here we also have 1/2 inch there. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and put my clip back on. I'm going to extend that and mark out just a little bit so it's not covered. Okay, and so I'm just dry fitting everything now. So we'll have the two centering rings here. Okay, and these are going to go inside each of my marks. So you should see a mark right there for the forward one. And we'll put the aft one on in the same way. Alright, if you're having a little trouble getting these over, you can kind of take your thumbnail here and just use that to chamfer in the edges. Kind of bending them in a little bit there. And that's usually all it takes. There we go. Okay, and here again we want this to be inside our mark. So that's where our centering ring should be when we're done. And then we have a thrust ring here that will go right at the end, just like that, and rest on top of the engine clip. Okay, so everything appears to fit. So I'm going to go ahead and take that out. I'm going to move my two centering rings inward a little bit. And then we can apply, you can use either wood glue or white glue. Okay, so I'm just going to put a bead of glue just outside my ring. each side. Okay, and it doesn't matter if you get it on the engine clip or not. Okay, and now I'm just going to pull these outward back to my line marks. Like that. Okay, and then the excess glue you can smooth into a fillet. And if you still have excess on your finger, just go ahead and put it on the other side. And it doesn't matter if you got this all the way around or not. If it really bothers you, go ahead and just put some glue on all the way around the inside. Okay, but we've got more than enough glue on the outside to make that strong enough. Okay, same thing on the forward end. Just go ahead and squish that in, and then anything left on your fingers can go on the other edge. Do keep it off the centering ring surface though. Okay, now for the thrust ring, I'm going to use a little wood applicator here because I don't want a big blob of glue to end up down inside of it. So here, I'm just going to use this. I'm going to put the glue on the outside of the engine block. Okay, and once it falls down like that, go ahead and put this in. And this way any excess glue will be forced up to the top rather than inside the motor mount. And you can just smooth that off. Okay, now with that, go ahead and let that dry completely before we install it. While we're waiting for the engine mount to dry, we can go ahead and mark our body tube. So just go ahead and center this inside the circle, and then mark on the tube where each of those lines comes out from the circle. Okay, so you should have 4 equally spaced lines, and they don't show it in the instructions, but I like to put in here a launch lug line ahead of time. So I'm just going to pick a point here between 2 fin lines. Okay, and then I'm just going to mark that with an LL so I know it's a launch lug line. And then you can take this to a door frame, or if you have one of these line marking guides, you can just use it. Okay, but you're going to need something that allows you to draw a nice straight line here. So for the fin lines, you only need to go about 1/3 of the way up the rocket here. And then for the launch lug line, I like to go about halfway up. Even though the launch lug doesn't go that far, it gives me something to align it with. Now, according to our instructions, the next step is to insert the motor mount into the body tube. But my motor mount isn't dry yet, and you really want to make sure that glue is completely dry, otherwise the centering rings may slip. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead over here to steps 8 and 9, and this has to do with assembling the payload section. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is find the bulkhead here. Okay, and then just the screw eye here is just going to screw into the middle. And you don't have to pre-drill it or anything. And if you're not quite centered, it's not a big deal. So first just make yourself a hole just down until the threads disappear. Alright, and then go ahead, back it back off, and put some glue on the threads. Okay, and you can be a little excessive here. And now you're going to put that back in, allowing the glue to go down. And I'm going to take this all the way down until the glue covers the little crack in the eyelet there. Okay. And then you can just kind of smooth that around. Alright, I'm going to put that aside to dry for a little bit. Now here you've got an option. Okay, so according to the instructions, we're going to glue the base onto the nose cone like that, and then the nose cone will fit onto the top of the payload section. Okay, but that eyelet doesn't connect to anything structural in the rocket. Depending on what you're going to use your payload for, you can take it out of there. Okay, well, I just got stuck in there. Okay, so it will fly without that base in because it doesn't need to connect. So you could just put this in like this. Okay, and that gives you more room inside because this piece is going to go on down here. Okay, it's going to require a little bit of a sand. Okay, but it's going to go in like this, and so if you have the nose base on, you've got this much room. If you don't have it on, then you've got all the way up into the nose cone. So depending on what you're planning to fly as your payload, you may or may not want to include this. Now, if your payload is going to be something like a simple altimeter, then if you put this on, you can put a little snap connector on this that will easily allow you to attach, say, an Estes or a Jolly Logic altimeter onto that, and then it can just hang down into the payload bay. So whichever of those that you want to do, I'm going to go ahead and assemble it as the instructions indicate. So I'm going to take here some plastic cement. If you don't have plastic cement, super glue will work as well. And I'm going to put a bead here, not very thick, right on the inside edge. We don't want this to go down very far, and if you get too much of the model cement, it'll melt the nose cone, which is not a good idea. Okay, so I'm just going to put the base on, give it a little bit of a twist to seat it, and then that can dry, set aside. Okay, now the instructions call for gluing this in with white glue. White glue is not going to bind to the plastic very well. If you have it available, the ideal choice for this is gel type super glue. If not, you can also try the plastic model cement, or you can do the white glue. If you're going to do the white glue, I would take some sandpaper and just roughen up the inside edge of this a little bit so that it's got something to grip on. Now, as we saw when I was trying to test fit, this is actually a little bit big. It's a nice oxymoron, isn't it? A little bit big. All right, now I also want to make sure it fits my body tube. Okay, so it's really snug in the body tube. So I'm going to take a little bit of medium grit sandpaper. And I'm just going to sand at least the forward side of this. And I'm just going to twist this around in here a little bit. Okay, we don't want to go too far, just enough for that to fit on. Okay, so just like that. And I'm going to do just a little tiny bit on the body tube side, okay, just so that it won't be so snug in there that it won't come out. That's better. Alright, so I'm going to go with the gel super glue method. Okay, and so I'm going to run this in a bead, again, right inside the edge here. Alright, and if you're not good at estimating distances, go ahead and use a ruler And I suspect this is about 1 inch long. Yep, so mark 1/2 inch on this. And that's how far we'll want to insert it. Okay, so now I'm going to find my mark. There we go. Okay, and as I insert this, I'm just going to kind of rotate it back and forth so we get good coverage of the glue and stop right there at my line. Alright, so we've got some of the glue being forced up in there. That's what we want. Don't cover this with the nose cone until this glue dries. Otherwise the vapors from this can cloud the inside of the plastic tube here. So I'm just going to set that aside to dry as well. So right now we've got our nose cone drying, our payload section drying, and our engine mount drying. Alright, since everything is still drying, we'll go ahead and separate and sand the fins here. Mine have partially separated just from being handled. So we'll go ahead here and finish removing the fins from their stock. And this usually just means cutting through a little tab around each side. Now if we look back at the illustration on the package here, the fins on this rocket have a swept forward part in the back. Okay, so at first glance these things don't look quite right because the leading edge should always be parallel with the grain, and most rockets look like that. Okay, so this edge here that's at a right angle to the root edge, that is the leading edge, and so these will mount onto the rocket like this. Okay, so now if you don't want to do any further treatment to the fins, then you can go ahead and just skip ahead to the sanding and shaping part. However, this is really coarse grain balsa, so I am going to go ahead and apply some sanding sealer to this. So the first thing I'm going to do is just stack everything together here and sand all of the edges just so all the fins are ensured to be the same size. And so I can just stack these on an edge, get them all in the same part there, and just give it a couple of strokes over a piece of medium grit sandpaper. And do this for all of them. Okay, and now I'm going to round over the leading edge to give it a little bit of an airfoil. Alright, and here again I'm going to start with 150 grain grit sandpaper. And I'm going to start here by simply kind of shaving down the corner. Oops, wrong one. This is the leading edge. You can taper the trailing edge too if you like. Okay, first I'm just going to do the edges there. Sand them so they're no longer square. And then I'm just going to rock this back and forth as I go over it to shape this into a rounded edge. Alright, the root edge should be left square. The tip edge as well. If you want, you could round or taper the trailing edge there. Alright, but frequently check back, look at this in cross section on each end so that we're keeping it rounded and more or less uniform. Okay, so I've got all my leading edges rounded. I'm going to go ahead and taper the trailing edges, but I'm going to do that off camera. But essentially I'm doing the same thing here, but I am giving it a wider pattern. So I'll go ahead and do this one and then do the rest off camera. Here I'm just holding it to more of a knife edge rather than trying to round it. Now the drawback to this is it does make the fin a bit more brittle, and so it's not quite as strong, but it does gain you some increase in aerodynamics and a decrease in drag. Okay, so now in cross section we're rounded in the front and we're more tapered in the back there. It's still not quite even. Okay, so that's about what it's going to look like. And as I said, I'm going to do the other three off camera. So here I have all of my fins tapered on the aft edge and rounded on the leading edge. And I'm going to use a polyurethane based sanding sealer here. There are other ones out there. Some are based on wood filler. You could also do things like papering or otherwise laminating the fins. But I'm going to use this. And here it's a good idea to have a piece of a cardboard box, corrugated cardboard, or a box edge. And we're going to need some straight pins. And so what I'm going to do here is place the pin into the root edge here, and it doesn't have to go very far, but just go in with the grain here. And this is just going to give us a handle to work with. Okay, and you can brush this on, or you can just use a applicator like I've got here. This is basically a big Q-tip. Okay, and just brush this on. As I said, my particular fins here are really, really porous and coarse. So go ahead and apply this fairly heavily. For best results, you'll want to use at least 2 coatings of this with fine sanding in between. And that's just a matter of taste. How much do you want the wood grain not to show? Okay. Try to avoid getting it on the root edge, although if you do, you can sand it off. Alright, your tip edge though, you want to get quite a bit on, as it's going to be very porous as well. Okay, now I'm just going to kind of smooth everything around here. Okay. And then what I'm going to do here is just put this onto the cardboard, sticking the pin down one of the little corrugated sections there. And that just allows it to stand without dripping somewhere. Do make sure you put it over a piece of paper towel or other protective surface. Okay, and I'm just going to repeat this with the other 3 fins off camera. Now it takes 2 to 3 hours for the polyurethane based sanding sealer to dry. So I've got those set aside, and at this time now the glue is dried enough on my motor mount that we can go ahead and install this. Now according to the instructions, okay, they're putting a ring of glue up inside the body tube, about 1 inch inside. Okay, so what they're planning on is for this forward ring to go through the glue as it gets pushed in, and that there will be enough residual glue to catch the back one. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and do that. Now, one of the things I prefer to do is I want my engine clip to line up with my launch lug. Now, this is a little bit sticky there. And it could be that I got a little bit of glue on the surface. So I'm going to give that aft ring just a little bit of sanding here. Because we don't want it loose and wobbly, but I don't want it so tight that it's going to bind when it hits the glue and end up not going in. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take an applicator, and for this I'm actually going to use white glue as it has a little bit longer working time. Some of the long working time wood glues also work. Now, if all you have is wood glue, go ahead and use it. Just be aware that it's going to tend to bind, and you have to be very quick on putting this in. Okay, so I'm going to take an applicator here and get it nice and gluey. Alright, and then I'm going to stick this up without touching the sides about an inch, inch and a half, and then go ahead and coat the inside. Bring that back out. Okay, lining up my clip with my launch lug line. We're going to push this all the way in until we are flush with the body tube. Okay, and just push, and then I can take a ruler. You can also use the edge of a table and just make sure that's all nice and flush right there. Okay, and now I'm going to let that dry once more for at least half an hour. Now, since we are once again waiting for glue to dry, we'll go ahead and assemble the parachute. So just cut this open. And most of the custom kits have their parachute in kit form. You actually have to assemble it yourself. Most of the other rocket manufacturers have pre-assembled parachutes now. Okay, so first we need to get this tape off. You don't want to try and cut it because you'll end up cutting the shroud lines. So this is one big shroud line. And so first we just need to tease it apart. There we go. And then we need to make this into thirds. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to hold on to one end. And I'm just going to start by estimating about a third down and making a loop on my finger over here at that point. Alright, and then with my other finger I'll make another loop. Alright, so that now on each hand I've got a loop and an end, and I can just let those slip until they're about equal length here. Okay, now I'm going to take one of those ends, gather everything up here without letting the lines change length, and I'm going to cut off the loop as well as the free end. So now I've got three ends here that are all the same length. Okay, now I'm going to pull those through my finger and thumb to get to the other end. Okay, and once more I'm going to cut off those ends there. So now I have three shroud lines of equal length. I'm just going to set those aside for a moment. Okay, and then we'll open up the parachute here. Alright, now there are instructions printed on the sheet itself, but they're a little bit out of date. And so there's this little card that comes with it that tells you the change. Alright, and that is shown here. So on the original parachute instructions, the idea was that you'd make a little J out of an end of your shroud line and use these little stick-on buttons to stick it in place. Well, they found out that they weren't holding very well. So instead, these buttons, well, one of these came off. That's not good. Okay, so my buttons aren't all that. Now, the adhesive's gone on these. Alright, so we're going to do something a little different with these, but what you're supposed to do is stick this on to each of those circles and then poke a hole through both the plastic and the button. Alright, we'll come back to that and a fix that we can use. But first go ahead and cut out the sheet. Okay, so we've got a hexagon there. Now, a little bit of traveling back in time to my boyhood. When I first started doing model rockets, this was how we reinforced parachutes. Now, these little rings are from the olden days of pencil and paper, where if you needed to put a piece of paper into a binder, sometimes the paper ripped, and these are reinforcements that would go on the holes in the paper to attach it to a binder. Okay, you can still buy these in stores today in office supplies. And so here I'm going to put these on in place of the circles that came with it. So just do this all the way around. Alright. Now if your self-adhesive discs actually work, then you do the same thing with those discs. And just punch a little center hole out. These come in handy if you have a parachute failure or a parachute rips at a launch and you need to fix it quickly. Alright, then what I'm going to do is simply take a pencil and poke the holes. Okay, so you can come in from behind here and just poke through that, making a hole. I don't recommend using a hobby knife for this, because it tends to slice through the reinforcement and potentially into your finger. Alright, so now I've got holes all the way around, and we can tie the shroud lines into the holes. Now we can take the shroud lines here. I'm going to separate mine out, and we're just going to tie each end to adjacent holes. Okay, so my first shroud line here will go between this hole and this hole, and to do that I'm simply going to tie a double knot or 2 half hitches around the hole and the reinforcement here. And this is just like you would do for the regular reinforcements that come with it as well. So at this point we're doing everything the same as the instructions. And just try to keep the amount of line used pretty consistent for each of your knots as much as you can. Okay, so that's one shroud line there, and I'm going to continue going around here off camera. Now that I have all my shroud lines attached here, I'm going to gather up each loop. Okay, so I'm just holding these on my fingers here, and then hold the parachute sheet in the middle like this, and then pull on the shrouds, and all of those corners should line up pretty close to each other. Now you can pull some of the shrouds back and forth if you need to, but unless there's a really big difference in there, that should be fine. If you've got one that's really longer than the others, then you may need to retie it. Over here on the other end, I'm going to grab that loop, and you can either tie this directly to the payload base screw eye as shown in the instructions, or you can take the snap swivel here, and I'm going to pass my collected loops through the swivel side of the snap swivel. Okay, so they're all passing through here. And let me lay this down so you can see this. Okay, so that's what it looks like at this point. Now, take the snap swivel, put it through the loops, the whole thing. So I'm just going to pass that entire thing through. Alright, and make sure nothing moves on you. Okay, I'm going to pull that, and now I'm going to pull this gently upward, bringing that loop up. Okay, and I'm going to recheck my corners. Okay, still good enough there. And so once you've got that where you want it, take just a little dot of wood glue or white glue and put it on that knot. There we go. Alright, and then I'm just going to work that into the knot a little bit and let that dry. Now what this allows me to do is store my rocket without the parachute in it, but still be able to come back and clip it on quickly. Okay, so when you're ready, you just open this up and hook it on to the eyelet there of the payload bay. All right. On other rockets, you just do this to the nose cone. Okay, and then having the swivel part here helps keep the shroud lines from supercoiling. So it's always inevitable that this may twist a little bit as it's coming down because it's never perfectly aligned. And this is going to cause the shroud lines to coil up. Now if it happens a lot, it means it'll tighten up all the way to here and the parachute won't work very well. The swivel takes out some of that coiling. It doesn't do all of it, okay, because it's, after all, just a little fishing swivel. Okay, you can get some of these that have actual ball bearings inside, and those work even better, but they're a bit more expensive. Mainly what this is doing, though, is it allows you to have this versatility of removing the parachute. So that perhaps you got a really heavy payload in there, you could change out this 12-inch chute for a 15 or an 18-inch chute. Alright, so go ahead and set your parachute aside once more, and we'll move on as soon as all of our glue dries. I'm still waiting for the sanding sealer on the fins to dry, so the last thing that we can do here before waiting for fins is to attach the shock cord. And so here you can cut out this shock cord mount. Now make sure you don't have anything important over here. We've already done these steps. And if you don't want to cut up your instructions, just make a photocopy of the front page there. Okay, so just use your hobby knife or scissors, cut this thing out. Okay, and you might want some protective surface underneath you so you don't get glue all over your table. So here, and now I'm going to take white glue or wood glue and pretty much cover this whole thing. I'm just going to run a bead down like that and smear this around so I cover the whole thing. Okay, and then I'm going to lay the shock cord, one end of it, across at a little bit of an angle here. Kind of like that. Okay, and what this will do is eventually we're going to fold this up, and it means that this will fold up next to itself instead of on top of itself. So now take section 1, fold it on the dotted line into section 2. Okay, make sure it's making good contact all around. And then fold section 2 onto section 3. Okay, and this is where you can kind of lay down that shock cord next to itself. Okay, and it's probably pretty moist feeling at this point, so be careful. It'll try to stick to your fingers and pull apart. Okay, and I'm going to add a little more glue to this surface here. Alright, that has the shock cord still facing there. Okay, and now this is going to go down the forward end of the rocket. So make sure your rocket body tube is oriented correctly. And I've made this kind of bow shaped so that it will fit up against the inside of the rocket. Now I'm just going to first slide this in. And it needs to be down about 1.5 inches at minimum in order not to interfere with the payload bay bulkhead. And I suggest just getting it down as far as you can get it. So if you got long, skinny fingers, put it way down in there. All right, and now I'm pressing against the shock cord mount and the tube and the palm of my hand here. So I'm kind of sandwiching the tube between my hand and my finger. And just press that down as flat as you can get it. Okay, and I don't think you guys can see this, but it's down there. Okay, and then once again, we put it aside to dry. Alright, and then something I like to do is wherever a fin is actually going to go, I'm going to sand the fin line a little bit. Okay, so just to give an estimate here, I'm just going to put this up against it. Okay, so it needs to go up to about that point, and I'm just going to take some sandpaper and just very lightly roughen up this edge. And all this is doing is taking some of the gloss off of the glassine layer of the tube, and this will make it easier for the glue to stick. All right, and it just takes a few strokes. We don't want to erase the lines or sand all the way through the cardboard. Alright, so now what we're going to do is take some glue, and here you can use wood glue or white glue, right, and we want to put a thin film of glue on the root edge. Now all these fins have a little tick mark that was burned into them. That is the root edge of that fin. Okay, so I just want a very thin film here, so I'm going to wipe off this excess. Even that might be a little bit thick. Okay, here it's a case where thinner is better because it'll dry faster that way. And so here I am going to attach this briefly. So this is going to be flush with the aft end of the tube. Alright, and I'm going to push that down, and I'm going to pull it back off and wait 30 to 60 seconds before I put it back on again. Alright, so enough time has passed, and I'm going to put this right back on. And so giving it that little bit of drying time made the glue tackier. And so now the fin won't fall off when I let go of it. And now I'm just going to make sure it is properly aligned with the length of the tube, as well as perpendicular to the tube. Okay, and I'm just going to set this up horizontally. I'm using my sanding tee for this. You can just use a couple of blocks of wood or a book or two, whatever. Let this dry for about 10 minutes and then repeat the process for the other 3 fins. And that part I'm going to do off camera. My fins are dry, and now I'm going to add the launch lug here. It goes on pretty much just like a fin does, although we don't need to do the wait for tackiness step generally, because the launch lug does not put a bunch of leverage on the joint. So just a bead of glue there, and now we're going to find our launch lug line and our mark. It's going to go right there. Okay, and this is why I want the extended launch lug line, is this way I can see it on both sides. Okay, and then go ahead and sight down the rocket, make sure it's straight. And that looks pretty good. So we'll let that dry and then we'll come back and do the fillets. Now that the glue is dry on my fins and on my launch lug here, we can go ahead and apply fillets. So I'll just start by putting in a bead of glue here. And I usually do 2 facing sides at a time. Okay, and then just take your finger and smooth that in. Okay, and then just go on to each of the other fins and do the same thing. If you're using a quick setting wood glue, then you can pretty much do these all at the same time. If you're using white glue, I suggest waiting about 10 minutes between faces and then doing the next, simply because the wood glue tends to run a lot more. And some people like to have really built up fillets so that they transition more into the body tube. And if you're one of those people, or you want to try to be one of those people, do this in layers. Don't try and make one big heavy fillet, because it's almost certainly either going to bubble or run. Now, another way you can build up the fillets, if you want, is to use either wood filler or plastic model putty. Either of those are good for building up volume there. They're not going to add a lot of strength to it, so you still want to do it with glue first of all. But then those materials are better at bulking up the fillets than the glue is. Alright, and now I'm just going to let this dry horizontally, or close to it. And once that's done, we can start putting the whole thing all together. At this time, my fillets are dry. And so structurally, we just need to put everything all together now. So I'm going to take my shock cord back out here. And this is going to tie onto the eyelet. It's kind of a small eyelet for this size of shock cord, but it'll go. Okay, and just tie a double knot in that. Try and keep the free end as short as possible so we don't waste shock cord. Okay, so tie that down, pull it from both sides, and then again between, and now cut off everything off the free end except for about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch. And this will help prevent it from getting up in between the block here and the body tube. And then you can also take just a little dab of white glue or wood glue and put it right on that knot. Don't use super glue or model cement for this, because it will melt the elastic. Just a little dab there. Okay, we're just going to work that into the knot. And it'll just help lock that knot into place. Okay, and then the final thing to do is to attach the parachute. Now you can do this in one of 2 ways. Since this has a really long shock cord, now the typical way would be to clip this on just like that and just close the snap up there. Okay, it would come down that way. But if you have a really long shock cord like this, and especially one that is not just bare rubber, the other thing you can do here is come down about 1/3 of the way. Okay, make a loop here. And then just tie an overhand knot into that loop. So we get something like this. Okay, and then you can tie your parachute via the clip onto that. Now the advantage in doing this is the parachute, if it's right here, the whole thing kind of falls at an angle, okay, because you still have the whole rocket underneath here and the parachute up above. By having it this way, the payload section comes down on the parachute vertically, and there tends to be less swaying and twisting if you do it that way. Okay, and we still have a very long, robust shock cord here. Now, anytime you do put a knot in there, that's a potential weak spot, but this shock cord is actually way over engineered for this particular rocket. So this is a really tough shock cord, much stronger than this rocket actually needs. Here's my completed rocket then, and I was able to put this whole thing together in about the equivalent of a day. What took the longest was simply waiting for the sanding sealer to dry on the fins. This is a great first payloader rocket as it goes together just like any other single stage rocket, with the exception of having a bulkhead in here instead of the nose cone. Okay, but otherwise this is going to fly and retrieve just like any other rocket. Now do remember, it is against animal cruelty laws to launch vertebrate animals in your payloader, so don't do that. But things like crickets or spiders and things like that are fine. If you are wanting to use this for an altimeter, drill a 1/8 inch hole in the plastic part here, right below where the nose cone shoulder comes down. This actually seals up really well, and so if you fly an altimeter in there with this all sealed up, it's not going to be able to detect the change in air pressure that it uses to calculate altitude. So don't forget that. All right. Now this does still need paint and decals, but I'm not going to include that in this video. So have a great flight, a safe recovery, and please stay tuned for more of my videos.